Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I ask the question, is the global temperature record credible? This graph is from NASA's website and shows four supposedly independent data sets: NASA, the Met Office in the UK, NOAA, and the Japanese Meteorological Agency. What the data in the graph shows is global temperature anomalies back to the year 1880, and you can see that all four data sets are in very close agreement from 1880 to the present. So we have four independent data sets from all over the world in very close agreement. The idea that NASA is trying to convey is that these records are very accurate and precise. Let's take a look at that and see if that claim is true. Let's start by looking at the NASA land surface temperature record shown here. What it shows is fairly steady warming since 1880 to the present, with some acceleration after the year 1980. The total warming shown in this graph is about 1.5 degrees centigrade since the year 1880. Now let's compare NASA's current version of the graph with an identical version of the graph from the year 2001. This one looks very different. They only show about half a degree warming from 1880 to the year 2000. Remember that in NASA's current version of the graph they show 1.5 C warming, but in 2001 they only showed 1/3 that much, about 0.5 C warming. So how does this compare to even earlier versions of government temperature graphs? Well, here's one from 1974 from the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, which is the government's official climate lab. This graph is very different from the current NASA temperature graph. Note that it shows no warming from 1870 to 1970. In fact, it shows 1970 a little bit cooler than 1870. And the other important features to notice is it showed a lot of warming from 1880 to 1940, and then a lot of cooling from 1940 to 1970. Remember that the current NASA temperature graph no longer shows this cooling from 1940 to 1970. The text in this July 1974 article is very interesting. Let's look at some of it. Droughts, floods, blizzards, tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes have plagued much of the nation and the world in recent years. Most people consider these weather conditions to be abnormal and temporary, but instead, climatologists now believe that the first half of the 20th century was blessed with unusually mild weather and that the global climate has begun returning to a harsher but more normal state. So they considered warming temperatures to be mild, and they considered cooling temperatures to be harsh. This is very different rhetoric from what climatologists say now. A few weeks before this article came out, in April of 1974 was the worst tornado outbreak in modern U.S. history. Let's continue back with the text. For the long run, there is mounting evidence of a worldwide cooling trend. The average temperature of the world as a whole has dropped by 1/3 to 1/2 a degree centigrade in the last 30 years. The decline of prevailing temperature since about 1945 appears to be the longest continued downward trend since temperature records began, says Professor Hubert Lamb of the University of East Anglia in Great Britain. So let's return to the current NASA temperature graph for a second. Notice that cooling trend from 1940 to 1970 no longer exists. It's disappeared from the temperature record. And let's continue back on with the text from the article. One more very interesting sentence here. Bryson is the leading spokesman for the view that man-made atmospheric pollution has changed the global climate, fossil fuel burning. So they were blaming this global cooling since 1940 on burning of fossil fuels. Now climatologists blame global warming on the burning of fossil fuels. It's pretty clear that the global temperature record being presented to the public by the government has changed dramatically over time. Let's take a look at some of those changes. This graph shows the NASA 2001 version here and the current NASA version down below here. Remember that the 2001 version showed 0.5 C warming, and the current version shows 3 times that much warming, 1.5 C warming. In order to make it easier to visualize how NASA's temperature record has changed since the year 2001, I'm going to shift the y-axis down on the 2001 graph so that it lines up with the 2017 graph in the year 1880. This view makes it very clear how dramatically NASA has changed their temperature record since the year 2001. They're showing a lot more warming now during the interval from 1880 to 2000 than they did 16 years ago. Also interesting to note are these blue error bars, which are supposed to represent NASA's 95% confidence intervals. You can see that they've shifted the data far outside of their own error bars, indicating that their error bars are meaningless. Now let's compare all three graphs, the NASA 2017 graph, the NASA 2001 graph, and the NCAR 1974 graph, and see how they compare. This view makes it clear how NASA has steadily removed the 1940 to 1970 cooling. The NCAR 1974 graph showed a lot of cooling during that period. The NASA 2001 version showed less cooling during that period, and the current version shows no cooling during the period 1940 to 1970. NASA now shows 3 times as much warming as they did in the year 2001. Well, perhaps that just means that the Earth has warmed up a lot since the year 2001. A good way to test this out is to compare the NASA data versus data from satellites. Well, satellites show a very different story. They show no warming since the year 2001, whereas the NASA data shows a lot of warming during that same period. So NASA has tripled global warming since 2001 during a time period when satellites showed no warming at all. So let's go back to the original graph we were looking at, the 4 different temperature data sets showing very precise agreement since the year 1880. Are these graphs credible? I think it's pretty obvious at this point that the answer is no. As I've shown you, the data has been highly altered over time, and the only way that these 4 groups could have come up with very close agreement would be if they were colluding with each other. Their data sets are not independent. Now let's look at where they actually had thermometers in the year 1900. This is data from the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia. You can see that in the year 1900 they had almost no thermometers in Africa. Let's look at the rest of the world. Almost no thermometers in South America. Not a lot in Australia, none up here, very few in Asia. So they had a very sparse network of temperature records in the year 1900. How could they possibly have come up with such close agreement in the 4 temperature graphs? Now let's look at the polar regions to see what kind of coverage they had in the year 1900. No records in Antarctica, and very few in the Arctic. What I've shown you in this video is that the global temperature record has been highly altered over time. The 1940 to 1970 cooling has disappeared from the temperature record. Temperatures have been modified far outside of their own error bars, and we have very sparse coverage of the Earth with thermometers. The only way that these four groups could have come up with the same graph would have been if they were colluding with each other. Had their analyses been truly independent, they would have come up with very different interpretations of the global temperature record. These temperature records are being used to drive policy, and as I've shown you, they're garbage. But the implications of bad temperature graphs extends far beyond that. Much of climate science depends on the accuracy of these graphs, and if the graphs themselves are tainted, then the underlying research is also tainted. The work that's being done by these climate scientists at NASA is complete garbage. Had their space people done work this way, they never would have gotten a rocket off the ground, much less gotten to the moon. Which is why 49 of the top people from the Apollo program recently wrote to the NASA administrator asking him to end their junk climate science program. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.